Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from J.I.D. called DiCaprio 2. So I think my reaction to J.I.D. was pretty much about the same as just about anybody who stumbled across him on hype alone. Beginning with, okay, his voice is a little bit weird and pitchy, but man, he can flow. Followed by, my god, this guy's debut was seriously good. And of course, followed by, holy shit, J. Cole signed somebody to Dreamville who doesn't actually sound like him and is actually really good. Now I kid, somewhat, but seriously, J.I.D. came right the hell out of nowhere for me and a lot of other people. And one of my biggest mistakes in 2017 was not reviewing his debut project, The Never Story. Mostly because it was a really damn good album, but also because he's the sort of Atlanta rapper I don't feel gets enough attention. Very lyrical, but unconventional and off-kilter in a way that reminded me of some of the old Dungeon Family crew, along with a fair bit of Lil Wayne, Kendrick Lamar, and Anderson .Paak. Now, there are some moments that didn't quite click as strongly as I'd like from that debut, but given the buzz from DiCaprio 2 was pretty high, a sequel for his breakthrough EP, and following a string of pretty impressive guest verses, especially with Denzel Curry, I was really excited about covering this. So, what do we get from DiCaprio 2? So, this is an odd place for me to be in, because I've given DiCaprio 2 a lot of listens, and I do feel like it's a solid follow-up to The Never Story. The rapping is sharp as hell, the guest verses are varied but fit within the project, the production is murky, but I'd argue a little bit more consistent and polished than the last album. In a fair few ways, I would describe this as an improvement. So why do I feel cooler on this album than I want to be? Because again, I can certainly feel that it's good, but I still think J.I.D. hasn't quite hit greatness yet. And pinning down why that will likely be, it's a bit of a struggle. And I think the conversation has to start off with J.I.D. because he'll be the point that'll make or break someone trying to get into this album. Most distinctively his voice. Now, as I've said before, his off-kilter cadence and his switch-ups, they don't bother me. And I don't mind his higher-pitched, half-melodic timbre. But the first thing that you'll notice, especially given some of the structure and flow of his rhymes, is that the Kendrick Lamar influence is really shining through more than ever. Specifically Kendrick Lamar's higher-pitched, oddly detached delivery that often foretells when he's gonna spiral into a pile-up of thorny weirdness in his bars that can be so potent to really untangle. And this is where I can see why some folks who might get behind J.I.D.'s vocal timbre and off-kilter flow that can bounce across cadences, melodies, and tempos damn near effortlessly, but that tone doesn't always drive immediacy or firepower. Hell, when Kendrick uses that delivery, it's often to disorient the audience, and then later juxtaposed with a more plain-spoken or explosive rasp, which also tends to be my favorite tone coming from him. And with J.I.D., you see, opposite ASAP Ferg on Westbrook, he takes off more of the bombastic swell with a level of intensity that I really like coming from him, and I certainly appreciate how he inspired J. Cole to deliver one of his better verses that I've heard this year, but it doesn't quite show off the same range of vocal modulation or intensity or range, and that can make it a little bit harder to invest in all of his content. Now, if we're looking for more proof of that in action, go to a song like Hotbox, where Method Man takes his relentless exasperation at his dealer's incompetence with a pretty solid but pretty typical Method Man verse, but then Joey Badass almost seems to be emulating J.I.D., and he runs into some of the same problem, and honestly, I don't think the intensity really comes through as much as I would like there. Now, granted, a part of this might actually come back in the production, which thankfully does not feel as barren or dusty as so much of what I've heard from Dreamville recently. There is a jagged, smoky fuzz which does a lot to accentuate how much J.I.D. will bend flows and tempos around sharper beats, the washed out synths and the samples, and the whole uncanny sense of eeriness to it all that's a fair bit darker than you would expect. And while there are a couple of beat switches that I do question, I could have done with a little bit more of the faster flows opening up slick talk, but for the most part, I can get into this production, even if I do think a fair few tunes could use a little bit more sizzling weirdness or bombast in order to crank up the momentum. And sure, some of that might not have been the point. Frequency change sets the scene with somebody just slumped on their couch watching a stream of fragmented TV programs, but I was getting into some of the warped melodic loop and the heavier bass knot behind 151 Rum, the piano touch soul sampling on Off the Zoinkies, the more lush and jazzy arrangements of flutes behind Tiiied, and that darker grind that just crept behind the outro of Just the Other Day, which might have the most distinctive hook on the entire entire album. It's definitely a highlight for me. But on the other hand, look, I know the late Mac Miller helped J. Cole with the production on Strawberries, and thus it can get kind of awkward when I say that both I can tell with the strings arrangement and the touches of horns, and also that I really don't like it. It just sounds tinny, it doesn't complement the song all that well, and it's probably the song I like least on this album. Kinda hate to say that, especially coming so much off that production. But here's the rub to all this. For as intentionally off-kilter as this production can be in order to accent J.I.D's flow and voice, it creates the expectation that a lot of his content will fall in a similar lane, and if I'm looking for a place where J.I.D just hasn't quite won me over yet, it would be here. And it's not about his technical skills. He's got an uncanny knack for stringing together rhymes in nifty ways, with the exception of some of the more stilted lines on Tiiied, which at least has the excuse of trying to be intentionally awkward. But this is more about his content, and I get the natural arc of a rapper in his lane on the come up is the Mo Money, Mo Problems sophomore album, and you know what, I'll at least give J.I.D some credit for being a little bit more self-aware surrounding speaking against drug abuse on Off the Zoinkies, and shows some of the violence on the single verse of 151 Rum. That song probably could have used another verse, because he's got a knack for enough brutally realistic detail in order to paint the scenes really well. I respect that, but it's looking for that extra bit of nuance and thematic coherence in his bars to further flesh out the scene, where I kept looking for J.I.D to mirror some of his uncanny style, and I just didn't find much to make his wordplay sound more striking or really hit for me, or hit upon some bigger ideas. Now, there is some of it. I did like the third verse on Slick Talk, taking the whole married to the rap game concept to its logical, hilarious, and very telling extreme, and how he might receive no credit for those he influences going forward. And then when you follow the method to his madness to the party aftermath on Just the Other Day, it's very telling how much he doesn't know how the seeds of his work will grow in the future, whether or not he'll even last. But where we get into dicier territory is his material on women, and look, he's not as bad as J. Cole, and I appreciate how we get a song like Tiiied where he and Black show their frustration with a girl's refusal to show intimacy even in some pretty basic settings. But then LMA comes back with her verse to show that they might as well just look into a mirror here, which is a very necessary flip to that perspective. But on the other side, you get songs like his attempt to give props to the girls on the come up on Working Out who want a piece of his success now, but he can't quite avoid describing them like venomous snakes. And then it gets worse on Strawberries, where he's trying to be a psalm supporting the relationship through the tough times, but it still feels uncomfortably stuffed with accusations and lines about after a few abortions how her pussy's a haunted house, or after he tries to elevate a girl who's a feminist who raps by calling her feminem. That's a nice flip there. He falls on the same natural beauty appreciation lines that Kendrick Lamar hit on Humble, and he says that he'll tell her like it is, like Ron Burgundy. Probably not the best icon in speaking to those topics to women, given from what I remember from Anchorman. That's all I'm saying. But at the end of the day, again, I think this is a pretty good album, but where it falls into a weird place for me, where I was expecting greatness, and yet less of this clicked than I was really hoping. I'd argue J.I.D has a ton of potential as a rapper, and I like him when he gets weirder and more cerebral, and a little bit more intense as well. But the content often doesn't quite get there, and maybe a greater shot of challenging vibrancy in the production would really push him in the right direction. Which is kind of ironic, because for as much as I prefer J.I.D to the rest of the Dreamville roster, it's very similar advice that I would give them overall. So yeah, I'm thinking 7 out of 10, a recommendation, especially if you're already a fan, you'll probably love this. But if you weren't wild about him before, I'm not sure this will change your mind. But if you're curious, yeah, I can see J.I.D sticking around, so you'll want to check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. J.I.D fans, the comments are down there. Have fun. You want to actually go to the poll and tell me how wrong I am? I'm looking forward to it. But hey, if you want to buy or stream the album, links are also in the description down there below. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support this channel, because I am covering this pretty soon, but if you want me to cover other things, the link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, guys who want to have albums, movies, or even a top 10 list add to that schedule, there's your opportunity. Link to my schedule, it's on my Instagram, down there below. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.